Hello, students. This is the last lecture for the 2019-2020 school year. This will be my last lecture to you as your history teacher before you move to the upper echelons of schooling. Just want to start off by saying that it has been an honor and a pleasure to be your history teacher. It's probably even worse that I don't get to teach this last lecture in person. But I'm just thankful for the time that we did have together. I know that this class is destined for great things. I have had many great memories with this class. I've enjoyed teaching you from 7th grade, beginning of 7th grade to 8th grade now. And just wanted to say thank you for being great students, being easy to teach, and providing me with many great memories and a lot of laughs over the last 2 years. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up with, this is continuing yesterday's lecture. We picked up with JFK's inauguration. He was elected in 1960, became president in early 1961, and he encountered some problems pretty early on. First and foremost, with the creation or construction of the Berlin Wall. If you remember, Germany was split between West Germany and East Germany. West Germany was controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain, whereas East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. Inside of East Germany was the city of Berlin that was also divided. West Berlin was controlled by France, Great Britain, and the United States, while East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union decided to construct the Berlin Wall that would divide West Berlin, Free Berlin, and East Berlin, which was controlled by communism. And this was not built to keep people out of East Berlin. In fact, the Berlin Wall was being built by communists to keep people in East Germany, because there were so many people who lived in East Berlin that wanted to escape into freedom of West Berlin. And so this Berlin Wall, you can see the construction of it. It looked like a military zone because there was barbed wire. There were crow's nests where there were snipers that were willing to shoot anyone who was attempting to leave. There were people who attempted to cross over this wall that were shot right then and there, trying to escape to freedom. So the Berlin Wall, we see its creation to keep people under the slavery of communism. And then we encounter JFK's incident with Cuba. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was president and Fidel Castro had already taken over Cuba, the CIA came up with a plan to oust Fidel Castro from his leadership role and his dictatorship in Cuba. They wanted to invade the city of Trinidad, but whenever JFK took the presidency and the CIA came up to him and said, "This is our plan," he said, "This is terrible." He said, "It's too out in the open." He said, "We'll be invading a sovereign nation, a nation that has not provoked us. We're just invading a country because we don't like its leader." He said, "If you're going to do this, it needs to be covert. It needs to be kept under wraps. And we don't need to let anyone know that we're about to invade Cuba." Now, you might be asking, how are they going to invade Cuba and try to keep it under wraps and not let the Cubans know that it's really the United States behind it? Well, there were about 1,400 Cuban exiles who had sailed on rafts or have flown across the Caribbean into Florida that had signed up to revolt against Fidel Castro's regime. And the hope was that once they landed in Cuba, Cubans all over the nation would rise up and join this revolution and oust Castro. So how did they go about this? Well, the United States Navy would drop these Cuban revolutionaries off in transport boats, where then they would sail into Cuba. President Kennedy had also designed for the United States Air Force to provide air cover and to destroy Castro's Air Force, which is very tiny. But what they would have to do is they would have to fly from South America all the way to Cuba for these airstrikes. And what are you going to do whenever the Cubans see United States airplanes? Well, they actually painted the airplanes to look like stolen Cuban airplanes. Well, when everything started, I'm going to bring up a map here. We decided to invade in this location called the Bay of Pigs right here. Now, this map here is the tip of Florida right here. Okay, here's the Caribbean, and then you have Cuba. And then here's the Yucatan Peninsula, the tip of Mexico, and Central America right here, and then South America, the top of that. And so we decided to drop them off right out here along the Bay of Pigs, where the revolutionaries, the Cuban revolutionaries, went in. Now, they were expecting air cover from these planes. However, at the last second, it's reported that President Kennedy called off the airstrike. We believe that he got cold feet, that he knew that this plan was no longer under wraps, that Castro knew about it, and so he wanted to pull out before the Cubans could point at the United States and have proof that the United States was leading this invasion of Cuba. And so no airstrike came. There was no air support. And these poor Cuban exiles, as they sailed into the Bay of Pigs, they were met by Cuban forces and just struck down immediately. Hundreds of them were killed. Many of them were captured. And so this invasion we call the Bay of Pigs invasion turned out to be a catastrophic failure on the part of the Kennedy administration and on the part of the CIA. So that was the Bay of Pigs invasion. But then things got even worse. You might be thinking, how could they get worse? Well, they did. There was an American spy plane, a U-2 spy plane. As it flew over Cuba, it got photographic evidence that there were missiles being constructed in Cuba. And these missiles were being provided by the Soviet Union. Well, whenever JFK, John F. Kennedy, realized that this was going on, he called over to Russia and was livid. Khrushchev knew that if the Americans were to find those missiles, that war might be inevitable. And here, I'm going to turn this light out. I don't know if that'll help or not. That war might be inevitable. And so John F. Kennedy gave a rousing and chilling speech. I've uploaded it onto the lesson, and I would like you to watch it, stating that since they had found these missiles, which, by the way, were capable of carrying nuclear warheads, that if these weapons were fired, the United States would have to retaliate in full, meaning they would use nuclear weapons on Cuba and the Soviet Union. So now you have a standoff between the Soviet Union, who's been caught red-handed trying to literally build a nuclear military base that's capable of firing nuclear warheads from, and I want to show you this map. Look how close Cuba is to the United States. This country, only this far away from the United States, has weapons that are capable of destroying American cities. This is a scary time. After Kennedy's speech, updating Americans that he may have to use full retaliatory action, people began to freak out. This is why we call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. People began to freak out. They were going to the stores. They were stocking up on items. It was like the coronavirus now, where you have trouble finding certain things at the store. It was like that then. Schools began practicing missile drills or bomb drills, where students would have to get under their desk in case there was a bomb. Well, Kennedy spoke with Khrushchev and said, I'm going to implement a naval blockade. So he was going to implement a blockade of Cuba using the naval vessels to surround this region and not allow any Soviet ships into Cuba. The Soviet Union stated, if you stop our ships, that's an act of war, and we'll have no choice but to go into combat. Kennedy did not blink. He said, we're going to have a blockade and we will stop your ships. Now, some ships, it's noted, some Soviet ships that were already on their way to Cuba, they turned around and went back to the Soviet Union. Others kept going, were stopped by the blockade. Once they were checked out, they did not have any missiles or nuclear warheads. I'm also going to upload another video that details the Cuban Missile Crisis in a great way, in that you will see how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to firing nuclear weapons at one another and starting a nuclear war. And so this was a very scary time. But both sides were able to come to a conclusion. I think they realized how scary and how awful it would be if both sides were to fire their weapons at one another. And so Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to come together, and Khrushchev said, "We won't fire our nuclear weapons if you don't invade Cuba. And we'll take back all of those missiles, and we'll go back to square one." And so Kennedy was going to agree to that. But then Khrushchev came with a second plan. He said, here's the thing too. Not only will you not invade Cuba, he said, but you need to take down Jupiter missiles that are located in Turkey. Turkey bordered the Soviet Union at the time. And so Kennedy ended up he ended up acquiescing to Khrushchev's demands. He took away the Jupiter missiles from the Soviet border in Turkey, and he also did not invade Cuba. So crisis had been averted, but it was a very, very scary time for the United States and the Soviet Union. And that brings us to the last slide, Kennedy's assassination. John F. Kennedy decided that he was going to campaign for his next election by going to Texas, which was a hostile area for John F. Kennedy. He was even advised, don't go in person in the streets, don't be out in an open car, people there hate you. But he said, no, that would show weakness. I want to show strength. So he went to Dallas, was driving in an open convertible along with the Texas governor, John Connally. And as he was driving down Elm Street, as he was driving down this location right here, it was right there at which he was shot in the head by Lee Harvey Oswald from this floor. We call it the 6th floor of a Texas school book depository where they were holding school books in this building. The president was shot in the back of the head. The governor was shot through the chest, really went through his shoulder. And so the car just took off. And the president was shot in the back of the head. This was a military rifle. He pretty much was dead at that point. But they took him to the hospital. He still had a pulse. And then he later died. Now, many people believe that he had already died in the car before he was even taken to the hospital. They were just doing everything they could, going through the motions. Lee Harvey Oswald left the Texas School Depository building, not seen by anyone. Later fled, was caught in a movie theater, was put on trial. But before the trial could commence, he was shot by a nightclub owner by the name of Jack Ruby. And we can see that picture here. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald being shot and killed by Jack Ruby. And so Lee Harvey Oswald was never convicted of anything. He was never able to tell his story, which means conspiracy theories abound as to who really killed JFK. Was he a part of a bigger plot? Was he a part of the Soviet plot, a Cuban plot to kill John F. Kennedy? Was he a part of the CIA or FBI's plot to kill John F. Kennedy? So there's a lot of there's a lot of conspiracy theories that go on about JFK's assassination. And after he died, Lyndon B. Johnson, a former senator from the state of Texas, ended up taking over and becoming president of the United States. So that does it for our final lecture of U.S. history in the 2019-2020 school year. I love you all. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you next time, whenever that may be. Take care.